This video is sponsored by DistroKid. If you want to make your life easier when mixing, you should consider using a channel strip plugin. They have a streamlined interface with all of the essential tools such as EQ, compression, and more in one place. With everything in one plugin, you can quickly make adjustments to multiple parameters without switching between different plugins, which may become overwhelming. Many channel strips also emulate classic consoles such as Neves, APIs, and SSLs to name a few, which can provide a nice, warm, and musical tone that might be difficult to achieve with other standalone plugins. In this video, I'm going to show you how I'd approach mixing a vocal exclusively using a channel strip plugin. There's a few channel strips I like to use, such as the Lindell 80 series and the API Vision channel strip, but I'll be using the Waves SSL EV2 channel strip specifically for this video. I've worked on real SSL consoles in the past. In fact, this is actually how I learned how to engineer, was by working on SSLs at Metalworks Studios, the place I attended for audio college, as well as at various studios across the city of Toronto at the start of my career. One of the great parts about working on an SSL is how flexible it is, giving you the ability to insert and bypass different modules like the EQ or dynamic sections as needed, and even adjust the order of the signal flow, moving around where each process takes place in the chain as you see fit. The plugin from Waves is just as flexible as the console itself, perfectly emulating the workflow of the consoles that I learned and worked on, but 100% in the box, no recall needed. It comes equipped with everything you need to mix professional sounding vocals, as you're about to find out in a moment. And I'll leave a link to it down below if you're curious to check it out yourself. And for clarity, this is not sponsored. I genuinely like this plugin, and I think you should check it out if you haven't used it in the past. Whether you want to use the exact same channel strip or a different one, the general workflow and approach I showcase in this video will translate to a lot of the different channel strip plugins out there for the most part. The real key is going to be understanding the thought process and the reasons why I'm making the moves that I'm making. And as a bonus, stick around to see me compare the vocal chain created with just the single channel strip plugin to one process with multiple plugins from different brands, and find out if a single channel strip plugin can deliver similar results. And while channel strips can simplify your mixing by providing all the processes you need in one place, the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid, could do the same for your music releases. They make getting your music on a stores a breeze with their simple interface, and they pass on 100% of the earnings generated from your music directly to you. Other distributors make you pay every time you upload something, or they keep a percentage of your earnings, which ultimately ends up costing you more. With DistroKid, you pay a low annual subscription fee that lets you distribute unlimited music for the year, making it much more convenient and less expensive than the other guys. DistroKid also gives you access to helpful tools for content creation and marketing your release, including hyperfollow landing pages, the Visi video generator, and much more. Millions of artists, myself included, love using DistroKid, and I'm sure you will too. You can save 7% off your first year by hitting the link down in the description below. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the content. Let's start by demoing the vocal that we're going to use throughout this video, which is an AfroFusion track called Basmati by my friend Everything Ocean. I'll play it once in context with the instrumental, the other vocals, as well as some effect elements like reverb, delay, and so on, and then I'll solo it so we could hear it in isolation, and keep in mind that I will keep it soloed from then on throughout the rest of this video so we can really hear how the channel strip is affecting the vocal before putting it back into context later on towards the end of this video.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor in a Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ride motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Overall, it's not sounding too bad, and you can see that I've actually gone in already and made a few edits to different phrases or words within the vocal itself to basically streamline it, make it sound a bit smoother, particularly harsh parts, sibilants, consonants, certain things that are poking out a little bit more. And this is obviously an essential first step before you do any processing, is editing the vocals and getting them to a place where they sound pretty decent. That being said, we can of course enable our channel strip plugin now to ultimately take this a step further, reduce certain problems, and enhance the vocal as a whole. Let's start by taking a look at the input section of the channel strip, which contains a mic and line preamp, as well as a few other parameters that we may or may not use. Really, I actually want to focus on using the mic pre in particular. In context, I noticed that the vocal felt a little bit buried around the other elements of the track. There's a few things we could do to remedy that, but the first thing that I want to do is ultimately enhance the level of the vocal, as well as introduce some harmonic saturation, which should enhance the texture of the vocal itself and help make it more pronounced pronounced, especially with the analog button engaged. If I don't have the analog button engaged, I could still add level via the mic pre, but it's not going to sound as colored. This might make sense if you're somebody that's trying to have a cleaner vocal sound, but in this case, I do want to add that analog flavor to it, so I am going to leave it on so we are able to get that total harmonic distortion in play. That being said, let's play this track. I'm going to slowly drive this up and find a sweet spot for it. I'll even push it so you can hear exactly what it does when it's overdriven.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no.
So it's a pretty clear difference. I am driving it by about 7 dB here. So obviously there is a loudness factor here to it sounding better, but we are also getting the texture, the saturation from this, and that's ultimately what I'm after here. Now, what's interesting about this mic pre is even though I am adding a significant amount of gain here, it only produces internal distortion or total harmonic distortion. It doesn't necessarily produce output distortion. So you notice that we aren't clipping, we're not entering any sort of excessively loud areas here where it produces a negative aspect of this sound. It's purely adding internal input distortion to the signal and therefore allowing it to cut a little bit better while adding that texture that I'm after. Moving on, even though this is sort of laid out in a specific way, you don't necessarily need to use things in sequence like this. Even right now, you can see the dynamics and the EQ are both bypassed at this moment. And instead, what I'm actually going to do is jump from the input section all the way down here to the filters. Now with an SSL, the filters traditionally follow the dynamics. However, if I enable this split button, what's going to happen is it's going to move this so that it's technically happening right after the input section. So it goes input into the filters, and then depending on how we set our dynamics with the channel out button, for example, that'll determine ultimately whether the compression comes before the EQ or vice versa. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But for now, I want to actually utilize the filters specifically. Now, no matter what plugin I'm using, I typically use the filters early on in my process to essentially reduce or remove the presence of certain frequencies, either on the low end, high end, or both, to really focus the sound that I'm mixing into a specific frequency pocket. Now, of course, with a vocal, it occupies a very large part of the frequency range, and we don't want to go too crazy and do too much. However, it always makes sense, in my opinion, to reduce some low end, especially as these frequencies can creep up and create some muddiness within the vocal and track as a whole. So ultimately, introducing a little bit of a low cut filter to reduce some of that low end presence can produce a cleaner sounding vocal and a cleaner sounding mix overall. I'm not going to be as inclined to use the high cut, however, because the vocal does have a lot of presence in the high end, and ultimately by using this, it is going to make it sound darker potentially. If I had a lot of issues in the high end with the vocal, I may consider using it. However, I think it's going to be just a little bit too drastic. So instead, let's focus on using the low cut on its own to produce a cleaner sound.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no.
So right here around 87 hertz seems to be pretty good. You hopefully saw me push this really high towards 350 hertz, which was obviously exaggerated on purpose. And you could hear how much thinner the vocal sounded. And from there, I basically walked back. This is actually a part of my strategy when I am setting this. I like to really push the filter to an exaggerated place where I really clearly hear that difference and then walk it back so that I'm not hearing as much of a difference to find a more natural setting. Obviously, every vocal is different and you want to set this around your vocal in particular, but I do find that typically I am going to be filtering somewhere between 70 to sometimes just beyond 100 hertz on the low end. At the end of the day, the goal is to clean the vocal up, but without having it sound too unnatural or too thin. We still want to preserve the low end presence because that's where a lot of that warmth and body of the vocal is, but I just want to remove some of that muddiness or potential for muddiness, especially as we work through some of these other processes like compression and EQ, which could exaggerate that low end a little bit more depending on how we set things up. But now we run into a highly debated topic in mixing. Do we compress first or do we EQ first? Honestly, there really isn't a correct answer here, as it's going to fully boil down to intention and preference a lot of times. But this is also a challenge of using a channel strip. You only have access to basically one version of each process, especially if you're only trying to use one plugin or one channel strip in this case. So you have to be a little bit more calculated and precise with what you are trying to do. Should we use the EQ first and I only have one instance of it, or should I use the compression section and dynamic section first because we only have one one instance of that. Now for me, I'm typically introducing a few instances of each of these. I'm typically doing a little bit of EQ, then a little bit of compression, a little bit more EQ, a little more compression. And you'll see this if you watch any of my other videos where I'm using 8 to 10 plugins in a chain, each working very gently and delicately, mind you. I'm not going crazy a lot of times, but I am able to gently massage things into place. At least that's how I think about it. But in this case, I need to be a lot more calculated, as I said. And for that reason, even though I do typically use EQ first after the filters, I actually want to introduce the dynamic section first because I want to use both the gate expander and the compressor. And knowing that I only have one instance of the EQ, I want to save that for afterwards, for a post process, so to speak. So with that being said, I'm going to unbypass the dynamic section. Because I haven't selected channel out, this is essentially going to happen right after the filters, as I mentioned. However, if you are someone that wanted to EQ first, you could simply hit this channel out button, and what's going to happen is the signal is now going to flow into the EQ first and then to the dynamics last, essentially before the output. However, that's not what I want in this case, so I'm going to disable that channel out section and focus for a moment. Now, first I want to actually use the expansion section. Now, to be honest, this vocal isn't very noisy. There actually really isn't many problems, but a lot of times when you're mixing vocals, you're going to have headphone bleed, rustling, and a lot of stuff potentially happening in the background, maybe air and noise floating around that ultimately comes in during those pauses of the vocal performance, right? And you can see there are a couple of pauses and dips in the performance where the artist Oshan stops performing, for example, like right here, or at the end of this phrase, or even some of these moments right here. Again, it's actually not too bad in this case, but for the sake of this example, I want to show you how I would approach using that, so that way you're armed with this knowledge if you decide to use it yourself. Now, this is a gate and an expander. They basically function to do the same thing, which is minimize or reduce moments that fall below a threshold. Typically, we're trying to set this up so that way when these quiet moments happen, they ultimately fall below the threshold and get reduced by the gate or expander. Now, gate and expansion is essentially doing the same thing. It's increasing dynamic range, but they do it in a slightly different way in the sense that a gate is ultimately the more aggressive form. Gating fully mutes something when it falls below the threshold, whereas expansion will essentially reduce it a little bit more gently, and therefore I find expansion to be the more transparent sounding of the two, but depending on your situation, you may want to reach for a gate over an expander and vice versa. In my case, because the problems aren't really present here, I'm going to disable the gate and it's going to use this as an expander. And just for clarity, the goal here is really just to clean up the vocal performance if there is noise and other stuff happening in the background, particularly during those pauses, as I mentioned. So with that being said, we want to dial in some extreme settings here just to really make sure that we're hearing the expansion properly, and then we're going to adjust them a little bit further. Therefore, I'm going to dial in a very high range, and you can see here the left side is showing the gain reduction that's taking place that pertains to the expansion or the gate itself, whereas the right side pertains to the compressor, which we'll talk about afterwards. But we have a high range, and I'm going to dial in a high threshold as well. From here, I'm going to change the attack to be fast, and I'll also set the release to be fast. So essentially, things can really cut through clearly, but they have to pass these extreme settings in order to do so. That being said, when I play this, you're going to see that this doesn't really sound that great, and my goal is ultimately going to be to reset the threshold, bringing it down to a place where stuff actually gets through the expander, and then adjust and finesse these details to make it sound a bit more natural. So let's do that.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want Ramoto and a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So notice how the vocal actually starts to feel a bit more dynamic through this process, right? Even though it's clamping down, and it's clamping down very selectively. For example, you notice this really lights up during this intro quiet part, right? And a lot of times it's also doing the same thing during these gaps in the performance. So it's ultimately muting stuff that really has very little there in the first place. And again, this isn't the noisiest vocal, so this isn't always the best example. However, if you have a lot of noise in these sections, you're ultimately going to make sure you set the threshold in a way where the noise doesn't pass past the threshold, but your actual vocal does. You notice when I had a high threshold that you're getting almost like this chittering kind of sound where like stuff sort of started to break through, but it was obviously really, really choppy, and that didn't really sound that good. However, by dialing things back, you can see that I'm only getting an extreme reaction during moments that are pretty much fully quiet. And then at the same time, it is reducing some of the gaps in between when there's little breaks in the performance, which is producing this more dynamic response, a little bit more of a rhythmic response in a way. And I think that actually sounds better in general, even without noise on this vocal. Now, even though we've used the expander to essentially increase the dynamic range a little bit more, which has added that rhythmic feeling as I mentioned, I also want to use some compression to ultimately even out the vocal performance as a whole, especially since there's some dips and peaks at varying times. You can see there's some louder moments here, but then there are some quieter moments as well, and we can ultimately use a compressor to bridge the gap between them. This will essentially produce a more forward, consistent vocal sound where the loudest peaks don't poke out as much, and the quieter parts that are drowned out come up a bit more in presence. So to get started, I'm going to set a fast attack, a fast release. I'll set a medium ratio somewhere around 3 to 4 to 1, so I'll set 3 to 1 for now, and I'm ultimately going to play the track and dial in my threshold here. Now, as I do this, we're going to pay attention and obviously use our ears to find the sweet spot, but also use this meter here, which is going to tell us how much gain reduction is taking place, with 3 being the most minimal at the bottom. Then you also have 6, 10, and so on. I'm not looking for an extreme reaction in my case, probably about somewhere between 3 to 6 at most, especially on those loud peaks. But again, I want to use my ears to find the most natural sounding setting. And the beauty of this compressor is the makeup gain is automatically determined based on the ratio and threshold, so it's automatically going to compensate for any loss in loudness that's taking place through this compression process. From there, I'm going to adjust some of these settings afterwards to produce a more natural response, maybe slowing down the release, for example, or slowing down the attack. But let's first try this and see where we end up.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor in a Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor in a Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor in a Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want a motor in a Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no.
So somewhere around here seems pretty good. You can see that I've taken some extreme actions and then I've sort of walked back on them at the same time. I really drove the threshold to achieve 6 to 10 dB of gain reduction and beyond, just an extreme gain reduction reaction. Then I've walked back on that. And I did find in particular the fast attack, it didn't sound too unnatural, but I do think it was just very noticeable, that reduction taking place. So I wanted to smooth things out. I slowed that down ultimately. Same thing with the release. I wanted to slow things down so that way it's not sort of coming in and out all the time. We're obviously getting that benefit of the volume, which could sometimes deceive you a little bit. Sometimes it's easier to just hear what things sound like when you're only getting the reaction or the reduction. But after playing with this, I do think that these slower settings ultimately are a little bit more complementary to the vocal. And you can certainly hear that there are some frequency and tonal issues that are coming up a little bit more, which is a part of the reason why I saved the EQ for last and for afterwards to hopefully address some of these at the same time. That being said, at the current moment, you can see that we're ultimately getting around 3 dB of gain reduction consistently, which is pretty good. I usually try to compress things fairly transparently, 2, 3, 4 dB at most. I find once we're getting to the 6 to 10 in the analog world, that sometimes sounds pretty okay, but in this case, I don't really want to push it too much. I don't really want to suck the life out of my vocal. I still want some of those dynamics to be preserved, and I think I'm ultimately sort of achieving the best of both worlds here. That being said, we can now circle towards the second last step of our process, which is the EQ. Now, my goal in using the EQ is to make a few tonal adjustments to the vocal as a whole, which means potentially reducing some problematic resonant areas, which I'm hearing in the low end and high end in particular right now, and also enhancing or sweetening certain frequency areas that I think might make the vocal more pronounced or just complement the vocal. Before we do anything though, we have to choose between the different EQ types, which is the brown knob and the black knob. And you can see when I click between them, pay attention down here, you see them changing color. And even though it is corresponding to the low frequency in particular, it actually changes the behavior of the EQ as a whole. Honestly, I think this really just boils down to preference, as they both sound good and can equally get used in a mix to treat tonal imbalances and other things related to EQ. And if you actually have a preference between the two, please let me know in the comments below and why specifically so that I have a little bit of a better understanding myself. And one extra thing before we get started, this EQ also has a solo frequency function, which is super handy. Instead of needing to crank a frequency and sweep around or do the opposite, I can simply enable this, and then when I click a frequency and sweep it around, I'm ultimately going to be able to hear that frequency in isolation, which should help me identify and confirm if I actually want to do something with that frequency in particular. Therefore, I'm going to be keeping this on as I do this, and I want to start by focusing on the low frequency specifically, as I do feel like there's a real significant increase in the low end presence, which is something I find happens through compression in general, whether I'm using this compressor or something else. You can really hear there's just a pronouncement of that area. So I want to use either the low mid frequency or the low frequency in particular to try to tackle that, quell it a little bit, and reduce how resonant it is overall. So let's try it.
She didn't want ram, she didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So this first move is definitely an improvement, at least to my ears, right? We identified somewhere around 460 hertz, this sort of like low, nasally, honky type of sound, right? Very resonant, didn't sound pleasing at all. And you notice that I had a narrow Q to start. This really helped me identify and pinpoint specifically what I wanted to reduce. Now, if you notice, I eventually disabled this solo frequency button and took the dB cut all the way down. So I'm reducing it by 15 dB in this case, which is obviously a way too extreme of a reaction, and I was listening for that. I obviously needed to be able to not solo the frequency to hear what it sounds like without this frequency altogether, helping me confirm if this was the right move to make. Once I confirmed that, I basically reintroduced the amount of dB that I was taking out, so I wasn't reducing it by 15 anymore, but instead reducing it by minus 2.2, which I found to be a more natural setting. In general, I find that reducing something by an extreme amount and then slowly reintroducing it until I find a place where my ears just sort of like it, where it feels a bit more natural while also solving the problem, I find that that's usually the ticket, and that's obviously why I did this. So obviously I'm talking this through because I want to make sure you understand, but we're going to take a similar stance and I'll work through it a little bit more quickly on these other bands. Now, one other thing to note is I do still think there's a little bit too much presence in the low end once again, so I'm also going to do the same thing with this low frequency band, using the solo frequency function to first identify and then reduce a particular area. And because I do find this is usually concentrated, I'm going to use the bell here. I'm not going to be able to adjust the Q like I did with the low mid frequency, but I think this is going to be a little bit more targeted rather than say a low shelf, which is obviously how this would function otherwise. I don't want to reduce all of the low end. I want to just reduce a specific section of it to clean things up a little bit more. So let's try and do it.
Baby. Yeah, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ram, motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Now that seems to be it. This is, to be honest, a very delicate dance. I'm actually taking out quite a bit here, about minus 4.2 from about 161 hertz. Again, getting a lot of that low end presence, but the reason why I say it's a delicate dance is because if we overdo this, and I'm not really going to fully know until I put this back into context, but if I overdo this, it's really going to thin out the vocal. You can hear actually right now that it's a little bit more thinned out than it was initially. And while that does solve a problem, the low end is really responsible for that warmth and that body. So So to be honest, later on in this video, I might revisit this to make sure that I'm not overdoing it and that I'm not totally killing the presence. That being said, if this does work, I may actually compensate by adding a little bit of output volume later on, since obviously by removing the lower frequency range, or part of the lower frequency range, which is very dense and heavy, I'm probably going to add a little bit more headroom, which is going to allow me to turn the vocal up. And when I turn the vocal up, it's going to make up for any volume differences, and you may not necessarily notice that reduction at all, to be honest. It might sound a lot more natural. We'll confirm this a little bit later on. Now, one additional frequency area that I'm hearing is there's just like this sort of piercing harshness that's sort of coming through on certain phrases in particular. Of course, I could go in and maybe identify them, reduce them with some clip gain, as I've done at the start of this process. But let's use EQ to see if we could solve that instead. Here we go.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati. Yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
Now that's sounding smoother overall, and I did allude to more of that harshness in the high end. Well, I think I might have to actually use the high frequency band for this. Instead, I decided to focus this more on the nasally type of range, which is really poking out and plaguing this track. I am taking out about minus 3.5 dB, which seemed to be the appropriate amount to smooth things out and not have it be so nasally focused, which again, I do think is a problem on this song. And now I can ultimately use the high frequency in a way similar to the low frequency, where I'm going to use the bell specifically to sweep around and try to find that harsh kind of area, which I do think was somewhere around that 4 to 6K window, somewhere there. So let's actually see if we can do this using a bell and hopefully smooth things out even more.
She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want ram out the Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no.
So I obviously did a quick A/B there just to really hear the difference that we're making. And there is definitely a volume discrepancy, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But right here around 4.43, almost 4.5K, I feel like that was probably the area to reduce. Again, the sibilant area where there could be a lot of buildup of harshness and high frequencies. But of course, we can't just kill that area. You heard that when I was taking it out by minus 15 dB, for example, it was really making things sound dark. And obviously there isn't a Q setting, so there isn't a whole lot of flexibility here. We're just dealing with whatever it gives us. But I did find that this minus 2 dB reduction is again smoothing out some of that harshness, making it a touch darker, but I think we can ultimately use the output stage here to make up for some of that discrepancy. And overall, I do think it's smoothing everything out. Now, this is ultimately something that I love about this EQ, is that we have to use our ears to make decisions. I'm not looking at a graph and boosting things and letting the visual fully create a bias in my decision making. Therefore, I think sometimes by using this type of EQ in particular, this analog style EQ, I'm just able to make more effective and better decisions. At least we'll find out towards the end of this video. especially once I compare it to the other vocal chain that uses multiple plugins. Now, one additional thing I want to mention though before we move on is you can tell that this has been purely subtractive. I haven't gone in and added a bunch of frequencies at any point. In fact, I know that this artist has a great vocal chain, and I can already hear that there's a lot of additive sort of EQ on the high end in particular. It's very shiny, very bright at times. So I obviously didn't want to go ahead and add a bunch of high end, which sometimes you're going to do with an EQ depending on the vocalist, right? Instead, I focused on solving the problems within the vocal itself, or at least the problems that I felt were there. That low mid muddiness, that low frequency buildup that's also creating muddiness, certain problems with the nasally range, and even some of that high frequency harshness that's popping up. I'm ultimately using all of these bands to address that. And again, it's not perfect, but I think it's ultimately quelling these issues and making the vocal sound a bit smoother and a bit better than it did when we initially started. Let's now take a look at the final step here, which is the output. We can obviously use this to rebalance the level of our vocal. We can add volume back if we feel like it's losing something, or we can reduce it and find a better place for it. Now, for me personally, I actually want to take this track out of solo mode. I want to bring this output all the way down, and I want to basically rebalance the vocal altogether by simply playing the track in context, adding the level, and finding a place that's most appropriate. I think that's going to be the best way to do this. So let's try it.
Smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor in a Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi.
Now, hopefully the effects and other stuff didn't throw you off too much, but I did find somewhere here, which is adding almost 2 dB back to the vocal. I think that felt like a good place. Now, I do want to acknowledge that some people are going to probably say, hey, loudness bias, it sounds louder, it's obviously going to sound better. And I do agree with that for the most part. However, this is not just about making decisions and confirming a decision. This is ultimately about placing the vocal at the appropriate level in the track at this stage. We've done a variety of processing here, which is going to ultimately adjust the relationship between the vocal and other elements. Therefore, we're obviously going to have to set a level that's respective of that. Sure, it might make up for some of these things that are lacking or that it's taking away through these processes. However, at the end of the day, if this needs to be set to 1.9, for it to sit into the track, that's where it needs to be set, at least in my opinion, right? Of course, you could do this however you please, but I do think that this is the most appropriate setting. It's compensating for what we're losing. It fits well within the mix. I do think there could probably be a little bit of volume automation as some parts are getting drowned out a little bit, but as a whole, you can obviously hear how this processing through the channel strip on its own is certainly an improvement. So once again, let me actually take this, put it in a solo mode, and we'll quickly do a final comparison just in the context of this vocal, and then I'll bring in the other vocal chain to compare it to. Here we go.
Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati, she didn't want ride motor Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake, she didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah.
Overall, it's sounding a lot smoother, a lot more balanced. Sure, it's a bit louder, of course, from the original vocal, but I think loudness alone is not the only factor here. I definitely think that all of these processes we've done have just enhanced the vocal as a whole and allowed it to fit better within the mix using just one plugin. Now, before we actually explore this multi-plugin chain to compare it to, I actually want to adjust one process that's usually found in my vocal chain that is actually not here because it's just not on the channel strip. Or is it? Let's actually find out. And what I'm talking about is actually de-essing. De-essing is, of course, just one potential solution to treating harsh sibilance. And this is actually a part of the reason why I went in and addressed a lot of stuff with the clip gain, right? You can see that I've cropped out certain moments and reduced them by a certain amount because this is actually an S. So I'm basically using manual clip gain as a solution to replace de-essing. However, the truth is this plugin actually is capable of de-essing. The problem is you essentially have to choose between using the EQ and filters for their intended purpose or using them to actually address sibilance in particular. And you would do that by hitting the dynamic sidechain button. By doing that, you're ultimately going to turn this into a way to allow the compressor to zero in on a specific frequency, aka a sibilant frequency, and reduce it. For me, I wanted to use the EQ in particular for EQ purposes. Same with the filters, and I didn't want to do that. So I basically decided to not use this as a de-esser and instead use it as an EQ. And the truth is, while I've gone to the extreme here by trying to use only one channel strip plugin, I could technically throw a de-esser either before or after the channel strip to make up for it and tackle those specific issues if they're present, all without creating an overly complex vocal chain, since I'd still be using no more than 2 plugins, for example, on my vocal in total. That being said, let's finally compare my channel strip only vocal chain to the original one that ended up on the final record, which consisted of 10 plugins. I'm not going to break down what they are, but I'll leave them on screen for you to see so you have a rough idea of what I did, and we can ultimately evaluate the difference between them.
Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi, yeah. Baby smooth like basmati. She didn't want Moto Maserati, yeah. She didn't want sip sake. She didn't want soft life, no paparazzi.
So they're ultimately not too far off from one another. There's definitely differences. I do find that the multi-plugin chain is a lot more consistent. It's a lot more hyped at the same time. And that's because I am using multiple compressors and even a limiter to really squeeze the volume out of that thing, as well as using some additive EQ processes with stuff like the Pro Q, for example, which is really hyping things up. Whereas on the other track, I really approach this from a surgical POV, which I do think is important to do. And every time I sit down to mix a song, I am going to mix it differently. This wasn't really about fully replicating what I'm doing in this chain. It was more so just to see, can I achieve a really good sounding outcome by using just the channel strip on its own? And I personally think that I did. I could definitely add a couple more processes, as I mentioned before, to ultimately mirror this and emulate this in a way while still having that channel strip do a lot of the heavy lifting. That being said, if you'd like to see me break down a more complex vocal chain consisting of multiple plugins, similar to what I just showed you here, I'm going to leave a video on screen right now that showcases that specifically, and it also breaks down reverb, delay, and the effects that go on in the background. I appreciate you guys for watching. Please smash that like button if you got value out of the video, and of course subscribe if you're new to see more mixing content like this in the future. I'll see you next time. Peace.
5